A single want ad tacked to the mercantile board read, "Wanted, cook and caretaker. 6 children. Must have a strong constitution." For 24-year-old Josephine McCarthy, those words weren't a job offer. They were a lifeline. Running from a past that threatened to put her in a pine box, she didn't expect to find a sprawling Montana cattle empire teetering on the edge of ruin, and she certainly didn't expect Gideon Hayes. A widow whose eyes were as cold as a blizzard, and a family so shattered she wasn't sure if she was hired to feed them or save them. The wagon ride out of Virginia City was a bone-rattling journey that tested the limits of Josephine's endurance. Driven by a neighbor, an old Swede named Nels Gunderson, the buckboard bounced over rutted wagon trails bordered by the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains. Josephine sat ramrod straight, clutching her single-worn carpetbag on her lap. Her knuckles were white, though whether from the cold October wind or the sheer terror of what lay ahead, she couldn't say. "Ain't no place for a soft woman. The Broken Ridge," Nels muttered, spitting a stream of brown tobacco juice over the wagon wheel. "Gideon Hayes is a hard man. Harder since Rebecca passed last winter. Fever took her quick, left him with a herd of 600 cattle and a half-dozen wailing children. He's chased off 3 housekeepers since spring. They say the man don't sleep, just rides the fence line and works himself to the bone." Josephine adjusted the collar of her wool coat. "I am not soft, Mr. Gunderson, and I need the work." When the wagon finally crested a hill, the Broken Ridge Ranch sprawled before them. It was a magnificent piece of land, nestled in a valley carved by a winding river, but the homestead itself was a portrait of neglect. Fences were mended haphazardly. The paint on the grand, wrap-around porch was peeling in jagged strips. As the wagon rolled into the yard, a chorus of shouting erupted. A boy of about 8, shirtless despite the autumn chill, ran screaming out of the barn, chased by a 10-year-old wielding a broken broom handle. A little girl sat in the dirt near the porch steps, wailing at the top of her lungs, her face smeared with mud and what looked like molasses. And standing on the porch, leaning heavily against a wooden pillar, was Gideon Hayes. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and deeply tanned, wearing a faded canvas duster and a Stetson pulled low over his brow. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but it couldn't hide the deep, bruised circles under his sharp blue eyes. He looked like a man who had been fighting a war he knew he was going to lose. Josephine climbed down from the wagon before Nels could offer a hand. She marched up to the porch, her chin tilted upward. "Mr. Hayes? I am Josephine McCarthy. I'm here about the advertisement." Gideon stared at her. His gaze was piercing, assessing her from the brim of her plain bonnet to the scuffed toes of her boots. "You're too young," he rasped. His voice sounded like 2 stones grinding together. "And you look too fragile to wrestle a calf, let alone my brood. The ad said I needed someone with a strong constitution. And I have one," Josephine fired back, refusing to break eye contact. "I can cook, I can clean, and I am not afraid of hard work. Unless you have another candidate lined up behind me, Mr. Hayes, I suggest you show me the kitchen. That little girl in the mud looks like she hasn't had a proper meal in 3 days." A muscle feathered in Gideon's jaw. For a second, Josephine thought he was going to send her packing. Instead, he stepped aside and opened the heavy oak front door. "Kitchen's in the back. Dinner is at 6. If the food is burned, or if you complain about the noise, you'll be on the stagecoach back to Helena by tomorrow." Stepping inside the house was like stepping into the aftermath of a cyclone. The parlor was littered with muddy boots, discarded clothing, and broken toys. But the kitchen was the true disaster. The cast-iron stove was crusted with old grease. A mountain of unwashed tin plates and cast-iron skillets filled the wooden sink. A teenage girl, no older than 14, stood by a flour-dusted table, desperately trying to knead a lump of dough while balancing a screaming toddler on her hip. The girl looked up, her face a mask of exhaustion and resentment. "Who are you?" "I'm Josephine. Your father hired me." A tall boy stepped out from the pantry. He looked to be about 16, possessing the same dark hair and stormy eyes as his father. This was Caleb, he sneered, looking Josephine up and down. "You won't last a week. None of them do. Let's go, Abigail." Abigail shoved the sticky dough onto the table and marched out, the toddler still wailing in her arms. Josephine stood alone in the center of the kitchen. The sheer magnitude of the task threatened to crush her, but she closed her eyes, took a deep breath of the stale, flour-choked air, and thought of the men she was running from. Arthur Pendleton's thugs would never look for her here, buried under a mountain of domestic ruin. She rolled up the sleeves of her dress, tied a stained apron around her waist, and reached for the nearest bucket. "All right, McCarthy," she whispered to herself. Time to go to work. By 6 o'clock, the kitchen was unrecognizable. The stove had been scrubbed and was radiating a warm, comforting heat. The floors were swept. At the center of the long pine dining table sat a massive, steaming cast-iron pot of rich beef and potato stew, heavily seasoned with black pepper and the wild thyme she had found in a rusted tin. Beside it was a towering stack of golden-brown skillet cornbread and a crock of fresh, churned butter. When Gideon and the 6 children filed into the room, they stopped dead in their tracks. The silence was deafening. The 8-year-old, Wyatt, practically climbed into his chair, his eyes wide. Even the angry 16-year-old, Caleb, sat down without a word. Gideon took his seat at the head of the table. He took a spoonful of the stew, chewing slowly. Josephine held her breath by the stove, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. Gideon swallowed, looked up, and met her anxious gaze. "It's not burned," he said quietly. It was the highest praise he could muster, but as the children began to eat like a pack of starved wolves, Josephine knew she had secured her place. For now, surviving the first day was a victory. Surviving the first week was a war of attrition. The children were wild, practically feral from a year of grief and neglect. Caleb, the eldest, refused to do his chores, leaving the woodpile empty and the horses unbrushed. Abigail treated Josephine with a quiet, icy hostility, constantly reminding her, "You aren't our mother. Don't tell me how to fold the linens." Levi, the 10-year-old, hadn't spoken a single word since the day his mother died. He communicated only in shrugs and defensive flinches. Wyatt was a chaotic force of nature, while 5-year-old Sarah clung to Josephine's skirts, weeping for hours. And Jeremiah, the 3-year-old, was a master of tantrums. Josephine realized quickly that she couldn't replace Rebecca Hayes, nor did she want to. She had to become something else entirely. A general. She started with boundaries and bribery. The bribery came in the form of sugar cookies, baked fresh at dawn, and thick slices of honey-glazed ham. But the treats were conditional. "No boots in the parlor," Josephine announced on her 5th morning, standing, blocking the doorway with a wooden spoon in hand, as Wyatt and Levi tried to stampede past her with muddy boots. "Take them off on the porch, or there will be no peach cobbler after supper." Wyatt scowled, ready to throw a fit. But the scent of cinnamon and baking peaches drifting from the kitchen was too potent. Grumbling, he sat on the porch and wrestled his boots off. Levi quietly followed suit. Abigail was a harder battle. Josephine noticed the dark circles under the 14-year-old's eyes. She was a child, forced to play mother to 5 siblings. One afternoon, Josephine found Abigail crying quietly in the pantry over a torn pair of Jeremiah's trousers. "I can't sew it," Abigail sobbed, dropping the fabric. "Ma used to do it perfectly, and I keep ruining it." Josephine gently took the trousers and the needle. "You aren't supposed to be perfect, Abigail. You're 14. Why don't you go sit on the porch and read? I saw a copy of Little Women in the parlor. I'll patch these." Abigail looked up, suspicious. "Pa says we have to earn our keep. You have earned it 10 times over," Josephine said softly. "Go." It was the first time Abigail looked at her without anger, but it was a terrifying incident on a Tuesday afternoon that truly cemented Josephine's position at Broken Ridge. She was in the backyard, hanging wet laundry on the line, the wind whipping her hair around her face. Little Sarah and the toddler, Jeremiah, were playing near the stone foundation of the root cellar. Suddenly, the frantic, screeching hiss of the barn cat pierced the air. Josephine dropped a wet sheet and spun around. The cat was backed against the stone wall, fur puffed, swatting violently. But it wasn't a mouse, it was fighting. Coiled in the dusty sunlight, less than 3 feet from where Jeremiah was sitting with his wooden blocks, was a massive western diamondback rattlesnake. Its tail was a blur, the dry, electric buzzing sound echoing off the rocks. Jeremiah giggled, reaching a chubby hand out toward the fascinating creature. "Jeremiah, no!" Josephine screamed. She didn't think. She bolted. There was no time to grab the rifle from the porch. As she sprinted, she grabbed a heavy, iron-tined pitchfork leaning against the washtubs. The snake reared back, its triangular head flattening, ready to strike at the toddler's outstretched hand. Josephine lunged, swinging the pitchfork with every ounce of strength she possessed. The heavy iron tines pinned the snake down just inches from Jeremiah's fingers, crushing its spine into the dirt. The snake writhed furiously, its jaws snapping at the iron, but Josephine held it down, her boots planted firmly, her breathing ragged. She used the edge of her heavy boot to stomp down on the handle, ensuring the creature couldn't slip free before grabbing a heavy rock and finishing the job. She threw the rock aside, fell to her knees, and pulled Jeremiah into her chest, burying her face in his hair, shaking violently. "Josephine!" Gideon had ridden into the yard just as she swung the pitchfork. He leaped off his horse while it was still moving and ran toward them, his face pale beneath his tan. He looked at the dead, 5-foot rattler, then down at Josephine, who was clutching his son, tears streaming down her face. He dropped to his knees beside them. His large, calloused hands enveloped Josephine's trembling shoulders. For the first time, the coldness in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. "I've got him," Gideon whispered, his voice cracking. He pulled Jeremiah into his arms, but he didn't let go of Josephine's shoulder. He looked at her, truly looked at her. "You saved his life. He was just reaching for it." Josephine gasped, trying to steady her breathing. I couldn't let it happen." Gideon helped her to her feet. The space between them felt suddenly charged, the vast expanse of the ranch melting away until it was just the two of them standing over the dust. "Go inside, Joe," he said softly, using the nickname for the first time. "I'll clean this up. I'll make the coffee." From that day on, the dynamics at Broken Ridge shifted. Caleb stopped glaring at her, though he remained aloof. Wyatt treated her like a hero, demanding she tell the story of the snake every night. And Gideon began to linger. When the children were put to bed, instead of retreating to his office to drink whiskey over his ledger books, Gideon would sit at the kitchen table while Josephine prepped the morning oats. He would nurse a cup of Black Arbuckle's coffee, watching her move around the kitchen in the lamplight. He was a man thawing from a deep freeze, and Josephine realized, with a terrifying jolt to her heart, that she was falling in love with a man she was inevitably going to have to lie to. As November crept in, bringing a bitter frost that coated the Montana grass in crystalline white, the warmth inside the Hayes farmhouse grew. Late one night, after a particularly grueling day of moving the herd to the lower pastures, Gideon sat at the kitchen table, his muscles aching. Josephine set a plate of hot apple pie and a fresh mug of coffee in front of him. "You're going to work yourself to death, Gideon," she said softly, sitting across from him. The formalities had dropped weeks ago. Gideon stared at his hands, calloused and scarred. "Idle hands let the ghosts in, Joe. When Rebecca died, I felt like I was drowning. The kids were crying, the bank was threatening to take the lower acreage, and I just couldn't breathe. I shut down. I know I did. I abandoned those kids even though I was living under the same roof." Josephine reached across the table. It was a risky, bold move, but she couldn't stop herself. She laid her hand over his. His fingers were rough, but they turned and gently intertwined with hers. "You didn't abandon them," she whispered. "You were just surviving, and you're doing better now." Gideon looked up, his blue eyes locking onto hers. The lamplight danced in his pupils. "Because of you," he murmured. "You brought the life back into this house, Josephine. You brought it back to me. He leaned in, the distance between them evaporating. Josephine's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could smell the pine, leather, and wood smoke on him. His face was inches from hers, his gaze dropping to her lips. She closed her eyes, leaning into the intoxicating gravity pulling them together. Thump. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Gideon pulled back sharply, clearing his throat and grabbing his coffee mug. Josephine stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Caleb stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the shadows, holding an empty water glass. Just getting a drink, Caleb said, his voice cold. He didn't look at his father. He stared directly at Josephine, a silent warning in his eyes. Before turning back down the hall, the spell was broken, but the lingering heat between Gideon and Josephine remained, an unspoken promise hanging in the air. 2 days later, Gideon insisted Josephine accompany him to Virginia City for the monthly supply run. You need winter boots, Joe, and the kids need a break from you bossing them around, he joked, loading her into the buckboard. The town was bustling with miners, ranchers, and businessmen. While Gideon went to the feed store to negotiate grain prices, Josephine walked toward the mercantile with a list of spices and fabrics. As she stepped onto the boardwalk, she froze. Standing outside the sheriff's office, talking to Sheriff Benjamin Caldwell, was a man in a sharply tailored gray suit. He didn't belong in Montana. He wore a bowler hat and smoked a thin cigar. Josephine knew that profile. It was Silas. No, wait, it was Thomas. Thomas Vance, one of Arthur Pendleton's chief enforcers. Pendleton was the ruthless Chicago rail baron whose corrupt ledgers Josephine had stumbled upon during her time as his parlor maid. She had seen too much extortion, bribery. A murdered rival. She had fled with her life and a small stash of Pendleton's own ill-gotten money to buy her escape. Josephine ducked behind a stack of whiskey barrels, her blood running instantly cold. She strained to hear the conversation. Thomas pulled a piece of paper from his coat. She's Irish, mid-20s. Goes by Josephine, or maybe Josie. She's a thief, Sheriff. Stole a substantial amount of money from my employer back east. There's a $500 reward for information leading to her apprehension. Sheriff Caldwell pushed his hat back. Can't say I've seen anyone matching that description, mister. We get a lot of drifters. If she's smart. She kept moving to California. She's smart, Thomas sneered. But she's careless. Keep this poster up. We'll be in town for a few days. Panic seized Josephine's throat. She couldn't breathe. If they found her, they wouldn't just arrest her. Pendleton's men would kill her before she ever reached a courthouse to testify. And worse, they would bring their violence to Broken Ridge, to Gideon, to the children. She abandoned her shopping list, practically sprinting back to the wagon. When Gideon returned, he found her pale and shivering, claiming a sudden migraine. The ride back to the ranch was agonizingly silent. Gideon cast worried glances at her, but Josephine stared blankly ahead, her mind racing. She had to leave. Tonight, she had to pack her bag, steal a horse if she must, and ride deep into the mountains before the morning light. But when they arrived back at Broken Ridge, the storm had already broken indoors. As Josephine and Gideon walked into the parlor, they were met by a chilling sight. Caleb was standing by the fireplace. The other children were nowhere to be seen. On the heavy oak coffee table sat Josephine's worn carpet bag, completely emptied out. Caleb, what in the hell are you doing? Gideon demanded, stepping forward angrily. You went through her things? Caleb didn't flinch. His eyes were blazing with triumphant fury. You're blinded by her, Pa. Making goo-goo eyes at her in the kitchen like some fool. I knew there was something wrong with her. Women like her don't just show up to shovel pig slop for a widower unless they're hiding. That is enough, Gideon roared. Look, Caleb shouted, pointing at the table. Josephine felt the floor drop out from under her. Lying amidst her folded chemises and petticoats was a silver, pearl-handled derringer. Beside it was a thick stack of greenbacks nearly $1,000, bound in banking twine. And resting on top of the money was a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune. The headline was unmistakable, screaming in bold black ink, "Prominent banker found murdered. Maid sought for questioning and theft." Gideon stopped dead, the anger drained from his face, replaced by a profound, hollow shock. He looked at the gun, the money, the clipping, and finally, slowly, he raised his eyes to look at Josephine. "Joe?" Gideon's voice was barely a whisper, thick with betrayal and confusion. "Who exactly are you?" The silence in the parlor was heavy enough to suffocate a man. The crackle of the fireplace sounded like gunshots in the quiet room. Gideon's eyes were locked on Josephine, his expression a devastating mixture of the betrayal he felt and the desperate hope that she would laugh and call it a terrible misunderstanding. "I asked you a question, Josephine," Gideon repeated, his voice dangerously low. He stepped past Caleb, towering over the coffee table where the money and the gun lay exposed like open wounds. "Are you a murderer?" Josephine felt a tear hot and fast track down her cheek, but she refused to look away. She squared her shoulders, drawing on the same iron will that had kept her alive on the run from Illinois to Montana. "No," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I have never killed anyone, Gideon. But I know the men who did." Caleb scoffed loudly, a harsh, ugly sound. "She's lying, Pa. Look at the paper. It says she stole the money and killed that banker." "Caleb, go to the barn," Gideon ordered, without breaking eye contact with Josephine. "But Pa, I said go to the barn," Gideon bellowed, a terrifying roar that rattled the window panes. "Woo!" Caleb flinched, his bravado crumbling. He cast one last venomous glare at Josephine before snatching his coat and slamming the heavy oak door behind him. Gideon slowly picked up the pearl-handled Derringer, checking the chamber with practiced ease. It was fully loaded. He set it back down and picked up the thick stack of greenbacks. $1,000 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a ranch twice the size of Broken Ridge. "Start talking," Gideon said. "And if I even suspect you're lying, I'll tie you to a horse and drag you to Sheriff Caldwell myself." Josephine took a shuddering breath. "My real name is Josephine McCarthy. I worked as a parlor maid in Chicago for a man named Arthur Pendleton. He's a railroad baron, Gideon. He owns half the freight lines in the Midwest, and he crushes anyone who stands in his way." The man who was murdered. His name was Edward Sterling. He was a bank manager who refused to launder Pendleton's extortion money. She wrapped her arms around her waist, shivering despite the fire. "I was dusting the library one evening. I wasn't supposed to be there. I hid behind the heavy velvet drapes when Pendleton and his chief enforcer, a man named Thomas Browning, brought Mr. Sterling in. I heard everything. I watched Browning strangle him with a silk cord, while Pendleton smoked a cigar and watched." Gideon's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he absorbed the horrific image. "And the money?" he prompted, gesturing to the table. "After they dumped the body, they left the house for a gala to establish an alibi," Josephine continued, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "I knew they had seen a shadow, heard a floorboard squeak. They knew someone was in the house. It was only a matter of time before they interrogated the staff. I couldn't go to the police. Pendleton owns the police. So, I broke into his desk. I took the money from his private safe to fund my escape, and I took this." She reached into the lining of her emptied carpet bag and pulled out a small, black leather-bound notebook. She tossed it onto the table next to the money. "That is Pendleton's personal ledger. It details every bribe, every extortion payment, every judge he owns. It's my insurance. If I'm caught, it goes to the federal marshals. But Browning is in Virginia City, Gideon. I saw him today outside the Mercantile. He's hunting me." Gideon closed his eyes, rubbing a hand harshly over his face. The exhaustion that had begun to lift from him over the past month slammed back into him with the force of a runaway train. When he opened his eyes, they were utterly deadened. "You brought the devil to my doorstep," he whispered, the heartbreak evident in every syllable. "You brought a Chicago syndicate to my home, to my children. I didn't know they would track me this far," Josephine pleaded, stepping toward him. "Gideon, please, you have to believe me." He held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. The gesture was a physical blow. "I believe you, Joe. I believe you didn't kill that man." He looked down at the floor, his broad shoulders slumping. "But that doesn't matter. If this man Browning is in town, he won't stop until he finds you. And if he finds you here, he'll slaughter everyone in this house just to make sure there are no witnesses." "I'll leave," Josephine said quickly, though the words tasted like ash. "I'll pack my things right now. I can disappear into the mountains." Gideon looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the stoic rancher broke. His eyes swam with unshed tears. He had just started to live again, just started to love again, and now he had to tear it all down. "You'll leave at first light," Gideon said, his voice completely hollow. "I'll saddle the bay mare for you. She's fast. I'll give you $50 from my safe. You ride north to Canada and you never look back." "Gideon, go to your room, Josephine," he commanded, turning his back to her to stare into the fire. "Don't come out until morning." Josephine gathered her things, her vision blurred with tears, and fled up the stairs. By 2 in the morning, a fierce Montana storm had rolled over the Bitterroot Mountains. Freezing rain lashed against the windows of the farmhouse, the wind howling down the chimney like a wounded animal. Josephine sat fully dressed on the edge of her narrow cot. Her bag was packed. She had left the $1,000 and the black ledger on her small washstand, along with a hastily scribbled note transferring ownership of the money to Gideon. It was the least she could do to repair the damage she had caused. She stared at the pearl-handled Derringer in her lap, feeling numb. She had lost the only home she had ever truly loved. Downstairs, the hound dog, Barnaby, let out a low, vicious growl that was abruptly cut short by a sickening thud. Josephine froze. The hair on her arm stood on end. A second later, the frantic, terrified whinny of a horse echoed from the barn, barely audible over the crashing thunder. They hadn't waited for morning. Thomas Browning hadn't just put up posters. He had bribed someone in town to point out the ranch of the man who had bought an unusual amount of women's supplies that afternoon. Josephine grabbed her gun, extinguished her oil lamp, and crept into the hallway. Suddenly, the glass of the parlor window downstairs shattered violently, followed by the deafening crack of a Winchester rifle. "Get down!" Gideon's voice roared from the bottom of the stairs. Gunfire erupted from the darkness outside, chewing through the wooden siding of the house. Splinters flew like shrapnel in the parlor. Josephine hit the floor, crawling on her belly toward the children's rooms. Wyatt and Levi were already awake, huddled together in terror. Abigail was clutching little Sarah, her eyes wide with panic. "What's happening?" Abigail screamed over the din. "We are under attack," Josephine said, her voice surprisingly steady. The time for fear was over. The general had returned. "Abigail, take Sarah. Levi, grab Jeremiah. We are going down the back stairs to the root cellar. Move. Now." She ushered the terrified children down the narrow servant's staircase at the back of the house. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the sporadic flashes of lightning. Outside, she could see the silhouettes of at least 3 men taking cover behind the water trough and the buckboard wagon. They reached the heavy wooden door of the root cellar just as the back door of the kitchen was kicked open. A massive man in a soaked duster stepped inside, a Colt revolver gripped in his hand. It wasn't Browning. It was a hired gun, his face scarred and ugly in the dim light. He saw Josephine and the children. An evil grin spread across his face. "Well now, look what we have here. The boss just wanted the girl, but I reckon no witnesses is the rule." He raised his revolver, aiming it directly at Abigail. Josephine didn't hesitate. She shoved Abigail hard into the cellar, stepping squarely into the man's line of fire. She raised her tiny Derringer, but before she could pull the trigger, a figure launched out of the pantry shadows. It was Caleb. He tackled the massive gunman around the waist. The gun went off, the bullet burying itself into the ceiling. The two of them crashed into the heavy oak dining table, sending chairs clattering to the floor. "Caleb!" Josephine screamed. The gunman was too strong. He threw the 16-year-old off him, slamming Caleb back against the cast-iron stove. Caleb groaned, slumping to the floor. Dazed, the man sneered, raising his gun to finish the boy off. Crack! The gunman stiffened. a look of profound surprise crossing his face. A blooming red flower appeared on his shoulder. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees, clutching the wound. Josephine stood 10 feet away, her derringer smoking in her trembling hands. She had aimed for his chest, but the heavy recoil threw her aim off. It didn't matter. The man was down. She ran to Caleb, grabbing him by the collar of his shirt and hauling him to his feet. "Into the cellar! Go!" she screamed, shoving him down the stone steps after his siblings. She slammed the heavy cellar door shut, throwing the iron bolt into place just as another volley of gunfire tore through the kitchen windows. Leaving the children in the dark, she turned and sprinted toward the parlor. She couldn't leave Gideon to fight them alone. Gideon was crouched behind the overturned horsehair sofa, furiously reloading his Winchester. The parlor was completely destroyed, lamps shattered, the walls riddled with holes. He looked up as Josephine slid across the floor, pressing her back against the sofa next to him. "I told you to stay upstairs," he yelled over the storm. "They breached the kitchen. One is down," she yelled back. "The children are locked in the root cellar." Gideon paused, looking at her in the flashes of lightning. Her hair was wild, her dress torn, her hands still shaking as she gripped the empty derringer. She hadn't run. She had protected his blood. "They want me, Gideon," Josephine said, her voice dropping. "If I walk out there, they'll leave you and the kids alone. I'll take the ledger and make a run for the tree line." "Don't be a fool," Gideon snarled, grabbing her arm tightly. "Thomas Browning doesn't leave loose ends. If you step out that door, you die, and then they burn this house to the ground with us in it." He shoved a heavy Colt Peacemaker into her hands. "Do you know how to shoot a real gun, Joe?" Josephine felt the heavy, cold steel. She looked at Gideon, the man who had been ready to send her away hours ago, now entrusting her with his life. "I learn fast," she said grimly. "Good," Gideon said, cocking his rifle. "Because Browning just moved to the front porch. We hold this room, or we die in it." The heavy oak front door shuddered violently as a booted foot kicked it from the outside. The storm raged on, the wind shrieking through the bullet holes in the parlor walls, carrying with it the metallic scent of rain and the acrid sting of burnt gunpowder. "Josephine." The voice that cut through the thunder belonged to Thomas Browning. It was smooth, cultured, and dripping with a sadistic patience that made Josephine's blood run cold. He was standing on the wraparound porch, sheltered from the worst of the rain, flanked by at least 2 other hired guns. "I know you're in there, little bird," Browning called out, his voice echoing eerily. "Arthur Pendleton sends his regards." He was quite distressed when he found his private safe empty, and he was even more distressed to find a certain black book missing. "Bring it out, Josephine. Bring the money and the ledger, and I'll put a bullet in your head quickly. Make me come in there, and I'll let my boys have their fun with this cowboy's family first." Gideon's jaw locked. He looked at Josephine, his blue eyes flashing with a lethal intensity. He didn't speak a word, but his hand squeezed her shoulder, silently reinforcing his promise. "We hold this room, or we die in it." "Don't answer him," Gideon whispered, his lips barely moving. "He wants to gauge our position." Gideon shifted his weight, resting the barrel of his Winchester on the edge of the overturned sofa. He took a steadying breath, tracking a shadow moving across the porch window. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, a tongue of fire illuminating the parlor. A cry of pain rang out from the porch, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the wooden deck. Gideon had taken down one of Browning's men. "You'll regret that, dirt scratcher," Browning roared. Instantly, the parlor erupted into a chaotic hellscape. Browning and his remaining man opened fire simultaneously with repeating rifles. The barrage tore through the walls and shattered the remaining glass, turning the air into a deadly swarm of lead and flying splinters. Josephine pressed her face against the floorboards, covering her ears as the deafening roar of gunfire swallowed the room. Beside her, Gideon fired back methodically, working the lever of his Winchester with practiced, cold-blooded efficiency. Then, a sickening sound cut through the chaos, a wet, heavy thud, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Gideon slumped backward, his rifle clattering to the floor. "Gideon!" Josephine screamed, scrambling toward him. In the sporadic flashes of lightning, she saw it. A bullet had torn through the heavy fabric of his canvas duster, burying itself deep into his left side, just below his ribs. Dark, thick blood was already pooling on the floorboards. Gideon's face was ashen, his breathing suddenly ragged and shallow. He clamped a calloused hand over the wound, his eyes rolling back slightly. "Gideon, no, look at me," Josephine pleaded, pressing her hands over his to staunch the bleeding. Panic, hot and suffocating, clawed at her throat. "Stay with me. Keep the door covered," Gideon gasped, coughing weakly. "He's coming." He was right. The covering fire had stopped. The heavy, deliberate sound of Browning's boots crunched on the broken glass of the porch. He was preparing to breach. Josephine looked at Gideon, bleeding out on the floor of his own home because of her past. She looked at the hallway leading to the kitchen, where 6 children were huddled in the freezing dark of a root cellar. The general inside her, forged in the fires of survival, took over. She let go of Gideon, grabbing the heavy Colt peacemaker he had given her. She checked the cylinder 5 rounds. She cocked the hammer, the metallic click sounding incredibly loud in the sudden lull of the storm. "Stay down," she whispered to Gideon, her voice devoid of fear. Josephine didn't wait for Browning to kick the door in. She knew his tactics. He was arrogant. He assumed she was a terrified parlor maid cowering in a corner. She crawled furiously to the side of the door, pressing her back against the wall, out of the direct line of sight. Smash. The heavy oak door flew open, the lock giving way with a splintering crack. Thomas Browning stepped into the parlor, a kerosene lantern in one hand and a Smith & Wesson revolver in the other. Rain whipped through the open doorway, soaking his expensive gray suit. He held the lantern high, illuminating the ruined room. He saw Gideon slumped behind the sofa, bleeding heavily. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Look at this," Browning sneered, stepping further into the room. "A noble sacrifice for a thieving whore. Where is she, rancher?" Josephine stepped out from the shadows of the wall, raising the heavy Colt with both hands, pointing it squarely at the center of Browning's chest. "I'm right here, Thomas." Browning swung around, surprised but quickly masking it with a condescending laugh. "Josephine, look at you, playing cowgirl. Put that cannon down before you break your wrist." "I shot your man in the kitchen," Josephine lied, keeping her voice dead level. She hadn't killed him, only wounded him. But Browning didn't need to know that. "And Gideon shot your man on the porch. It's just you now, Thomas." Browning's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes darting to the hallway. "You're bluffing. You don't have the stomach to kill me. You murdered Mr. Sterling while he was bound to a chair," Josephine said, her voice dripping with venom. "You think I won't put a bullet in a rabid dog that breaks into my home?" "Your home?" Browning scoffed. "You're a fugitive. Hand over Pendleton's ledger, and I might let the cowboy live long enough for a doctor to fetch that bullet." "The ledger is in the kitchen," Josephine said, taking a slow step forward, keeping her aim steady. "In my bag." On the table, Browning narrowed his eyes, calculating the distance between them. He slowly lowered his lantern, his finger twitching on the trigger of his revolver. "If you're lying to me, Josie, go look," she commanded. It was a standoff. The tension in the room was a living, breathing thing, tightening like a garrote wire. Browning took one step toward the hallway, his eyes never leaving Josephine. But as he passed the stone fireplace, a shadow detached itself from the gloom of the back stairs. It was Caleb. The 16-year-old hadn't stayed in the root cellar. He had crept up the back stairs, armed with a heavy iron fire poker. With a ferocious, wordless yell, Caleb swung the iron bar with all his might, striking Browning directly across his gun hand. The sound of shattering bone cracked through the room. Browning screamed, his revolver firing wildly into the ceiling before clattering to the floor. Josephine didn't hesitate. She didn't aim to kill, but she aimed to end it. She squeezed the trigger of the peacemaker. The heavy bullet caught Browning in the thigh, shattering his femur. He collapsed in a heap of agonized screams, dropping the lantern, which shattered, miraculously extinguishing itself in the rainwater pooling on the floor. Silence, save for the raging storm and Browning's groans, finally descended on the broken ridge. Caleb stood panting, the fire poker still raised, staring at the fallen enforcer. He looked up at Josephine, his chest heaving. "Go get the medical kit," Josephine ordered, her voice shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. "And fetch some clean linens. Now, Caleb." The boy nodded frantically, his previous animosity completely burned away by the crucible of the night, and sprinted toward the washroom. Josephine fell to her knees beside Gideon. He was pale, sweating profusely, but his eyes were open, watching her. "You held the room," Gideon whispered, a faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. Josephine pressed a wadded-up piece of her apron against his wound, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I told you, Gideon. I have a strong constitution." The storm broke just as the first gray light of dawn bled over the Bitterroot Mountains. The farmhouse was a shattered wreck, smelling of wet ash, copper, and iodine. Josephine had managed to extract the bullet from Gideon's side, using a pair of sterilized tongs and a bottle of rye whiskey. He was feverish, but the bleeding had stopped, and he was resting in his bed upstairs. Caleb and Abigail sat vigil beside him. Downstairs, Thomas Browning and his surviving hired gun were tied to the heavy oak chairs in the kitchen, stripped of their weapons and nursing makeshift bandages. Josephine sat across from them at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, the Colt Peacemaker resting within easy reach. She didn't speak to them. She merely watched them with a cold, hollow stare, waiting. At 7 o'clock, the sound of approaching horses broke the morning silence. A dozen riders crested the hill, led by Sheriff Benjamin Caldwell, someone likely old Nels Gunderson, whose property bordered the lower ridge, had heard the prolonged gunfire and ridden into Virginia City to raise a posse. Sheriff Caldwell kicked the broken front door open, a shotgun in his hands, his deputies swarming the porch. When he walked into the kitchen and saw the two bleeding men tied to chairs and the exhausted, blood-stained woman sitting at the table, he stopped in his tracks. "Miss Josephine," Caldwell said, lowering his weapon slowly. "Mind telling me why my town smells like a war zone? And why there's a dead man on your front porch?" Josephine stood up. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the black leather-bound ledger. She walked over to the sheriff and placed it in his hands. "That man," Josephine said, pointing a shaking finger at Browning, "is Thomas Browning. He is a hitman for Arthur Pendleton, a Chicago rail baron. That book contains the names, dates, and amounts of every bribe, extortion, and murder Pendleton has commissioned over the last 5 years." Sheriff Caldwell looked at the ledger, then at Browning, whose face contorted with pure hatred. "There's a warrant out for your arrest, miss," Caldwell said carefully. "Theft and murder back east." "It's a false warrant, Sheriff," Josephine stated clearly. "Pendleton framed me because I witnessed Browning murder a bank manager named Edward Sterling. I took the money to survive, and I took the ledger to bury them. I want to make a deal. I will turn over the remaining $900 I stole, and I will testify in a federal court against Arthur Pendleton. But you need to wire Judge Walter Q. Gresham in Chicago immediately. He's been trying to build a case against Pendleton's freight monopolies for years. He will send Pinkerton men to collect these prisoners." Caldwell flipped through the pages of the ledger, his eyes widening at the meticulous records of corruption that spanned across 5 states. He looked back at Josephine, an undeniable respect dawning in his eyes. "You're a brave woman, Miss McCarthy." "Or a foolish one," Caldwell muttered. He gestured to his deputies. "Haul these two to the jailhouse. Put them in separate cells, and don't take your eyes off them. I'll send a wire to Judge Gresham within the hour." As the deputies dragged Browning away, he turned back, spitting blood onto the floorboards. "You're dead, Josie. Pendleton will send an army." Josephine met his gaze unflinchingly. "Let him try. I know how to use a rifle now." Once the house was cleared, Josephine walked slowly up the stairs. Every muscle in her body ached, a deep, bone-weary exhaustion settling into her marrow. She paused outside Gideon's door. She had done what she had to do. The threat was neutralized. The Pinkertons would soon be involved. And she had a long, difficult trial ahead of her in Chicago. She had to pack her bags. Her time at Broken Ridge was over. She pushed the door open to say her goodbyes. Caleb and Abigail looked up from their chairs. Gideon was awake, propped up against the headboard, his face pale but his eyes clear. "The sheriff took them," Josephine said softly, lingering in the doorway. "I gave them the ledger. Judge Gresham is going to send agents to escort me back to Chicago to testify. They'll drop the charges against me in exchange for the book." Gideon nodded slowly. And then, I suppose I'll find a new position somewhere," Josephine said, fighting the tremor in her voice. "Somewhere quiet. I'll pack my things now. I'm so sorry, Gideon, for all of this." She turned to leave, the heartbreak finally threatening to crush her. "Stop!" Caleb's voice rang out. Josephine froze. Caleb stood up, walking over to her. He looked at her, his eyes drifting to the blood staining her dress, blood she had shed defending his family. "You aren't leaving," Caleb said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "You can't. Who's going to stop Wyatt from tracking mud in the parlor? Who's going to make the peach cobbler?" He swallowed hard. "You saved my life down there, Josephine. You belong here." Josephine stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. She looked past Caleb to Gideon. Gideon pushed the blankets aside, wincing as he shifted his weight. "He's right, Joe," Gideon rasped, his voice rough with emotion. "You go to Chicago. You testify. You burn Arthur Pendleton to the ground. But when it's over, you come back. The Broken Ridge is your home. If you want it." Josephine walked to the edge of the bed. She reached out, gently resting her hand against Gideon's rough, bearded cheek. He leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. "I'll come back," she whispered fiercely. "Try not to burn the stew while I'm gone." The winter passed, burying the scars of the Broken Ridge under a blanket of pure, white snow. In Chicago, the Pendleton empire crumbled, dismantled by the meticulous records of a brave parlor maid and the relentless gavel of a federal judge. When spring finally thawed the Montana soil, the wagon from Virginia City returned. Josephine McCarthy stepped down, no longer a fugitive running from shadows, but a woman stepping into the sun. Gideon Hayes stood on the rebuilt porch, surrounded by a chorus of shouting, laughing children. He wasn't a broken widower anymore. He was a man who had fought through the darkest night to reclaim his life. Josephine walked up the steps, dropping her carpetbag. And as Gideon pulled her into his arms, she knew she had finally found the one thing she had never expected to find in the Wild West: a family.